houses just sit there, rotting away, forgotten by time. Others wait. This is the story of two friends who decided to spend a few nights inside one such house. A house that had been empty for nearly 2 decades. By the time they realized why no one had lived there, it was too late. Mark wasn't just heartbroken. He was broken. Financially, emotionally, and most of all, as a father. Once a realtor with promise, now broke, divorced, and hollow from losing custody of his daughter, he needed a way back. Losing custody of his daughter was the final blow. He told himself this house was a second chance, a way to reset. The owner, Alan, an interior designer now living in the city, handed Mark the keys himself. He explained he planned to sell the property, though he hadn't lived there in nearly 20 years. So, Mark convinced his best friend Daniel to come with him. 8 hours on the road, just the two of them, joking, teasing, and laughing like old times. Daniel had teased Mark, warning him that if the so-called dream house had rats, he was leaving. Mark only laughed, joking that rats were cheaper than roommates, while Daniel quipped that it only proved how broke Mark really was. Their laughter filled the car, echoing a friendship that had survived the years. By the time they pulled into the overgrown driveway, the sun was sinking. It was nearly 6. The house loomed ahead, peeling paint, cloudy windows, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest. And just beside it, a pond, still, black water reflecting the dying light of the sky. They explored the grounds first, the cracked porch steps, the dead garden, the pond that seemed too quiet, and then, finally, the house itself. While Mark unpacked dinner, Daniel wandered upstairs. The attic door groaned when he pulled it down. A cloud of dust rained over his shirt. Something small scurried across the floorboards. Inside, covered by a heavy rug, was a wooden trunk. The lock looked ancient, eaten by rust. Daniel pulled the rug aside, and when his hand touched the metal, a shiver ran through him. He shook the trunk, and something slipped free. A gold ring. Heavy, cold. Daniel wasn't the type to let opportunity pass. Without a word, he slid it into his pocket. Just then, Mark's voice called faintly from downstairs. Dinner was ready. Daniel left the attic, and over takeout in the dusty living room, he mentioned the trunk. Mark only shrugged, saying they'd check it out tomorrow. Later, as the house settled into silence, the two lay on their air mattresses. At first, it was only the wind, the ticking of an old clock. But around 2:47 a.m., Daniel felt something. A whisper against his ear, a brush of fingers across his feet. Not quite awake, not quite dreaming. He rose slowly. His body moved like it wasn't his. 1 creak, 2. He was climbing the attic stairs. Mark woke to the sound. Daniel was gone. His heart raced as he spotted him, standing motionless at the bottom of the attic stairs, facing upward. Mark called out, but there was no response. When he touched his friend's shoulder, Daniel turned, eyes wide, sweat dripping, before collapsing into Mark's arms. Mark dragged him back to the mattress, splashing water over his face until he stirred. Shaken, Daniel whispered of hearing a girl's voice, of how she had taken his hand. He rolled back his sleeve to reveal a blackened handprint burned into his forearm. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Daniel broke the silence, insisting they leave tonight. But Mark, desperate, clinging to hope that this house could save him, begged him to wait until morning. Neither of them slept again. The next morning, Daniel looked haunted. His hands shook as he held his coffee, eyes fixed on the attic. His anger finally spilled over. He snapped at Mark, accusing him of believing this place could fix his life, when in truth, it was cursed. Daniel pulled the gold ring from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. He admitted he shouldn't have touched it, declaring it cursed, before storming out. The car engine roared, gravel crunching as he drove away. Daniel took one last look at the attic window before leaving. Something about it filled him with unease he couldn't shake. And just like that, Mark was alone. Mark picked up the ring Daniel had tossed aside. The moment it touched his skin, he heard it. Faint, distant humming, almost a lullaby. He slipped the ring into his pocket and followed the sound outside. By the pond, a rusted swing moved back and forth, though no one sat in it. Mark stepped closer, his breath visible in the cool evening air. Something about that slow, eerie motion unsettled him, like the swing had been moving far too long for the stillness of the night. He reached out and grabbed one of the chains, holding it still with one hand. For a moment, everything was quiet, and then she was there. A young woman sat on the swing, her head bowed. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Before he could react, her head snapped toward him in one sharp, unnatural motion. Her hollow eyes locked on his. Mark stumbled backward, tripping over the damp grass and falling hard. When he looked up, the swing was empty, swaying as if no one had ever been there. Confused, uneasy, Mark tried to shake the feeling. He spent the day cleaning, sweeping broken glass, clearing dust, repairing what little he could. For the first time in months, he felt purpose. By twilight, he collapsed onto the couch, exhausted, the ring pressed against his leg. He pulled it out and stared at it. Daniel's warning echoed in his head like a fever dream, and then it came. 3 slow knocks from the attic above. Mark lit a candle. His hand trembled as he climbed the attic stairs. Every creak of the wood sounded like a scream in the silence. The attic was worse than he imagined. The smell of dust and rot, cobwebs dangling like ropes, and in the far corner, the trunk, covered in crime, waiting. He found a rusted hammer in a toolbox nearby. His breath caught as he raised it. The lock gave way with a sharp crack. The moment the trunk opened, the candle went out. A freezing wind blew through the room, clawing at his skin. Mark gasped, his eyes pulled toward the attic window. Outside, at the far edge of the property, the barn light flickered on, along with the house light. A crow perched on the ledge, staring back at him, silent, still, shaken. He turned back to the trunk. Inside were clothes, delicate, feminine, a faded dress, a ribbon, a small pair of shoes. And beneath them, photographs, a family, a husband, a wife, and a girl. Their daughter, but in every photo, the girl's face was scribbled out, deep scratches carved across her image. The man's face was unmistakable. Mark froze as recognition set in. He knew him. It was Alan, the very same man he had met him for the keys. Turning the photo over with trembling fingers, Mark found faded handwriting scrawled across the back. The words were simple, almost childlike. Mum, Dad, and me, Sophie. Mark gathered the belongings, clutching the album to his chest, and hurried downstairs. Whatever was in that attic, it wasn't finished with him yet. As Mark descended from the attic, the sound of crows crying outside grew louder, multiplied, like an endless chorus of grief. After reaching the bottom and putting aside the dusty boxes he had carried down, his uneasy eyes wandered to the window. There, perched around the attic window, were not 1 or 2, but dozens of crows, crying endlessly, their black eyes fixed on the old house. The sound made Mark's stomach churn. Something was wrong. Determined to confront it, Mark stepped outside and walked toward the barn. He waved his arms, trying to shoo the birds away, but they refused to move, their cries echoing like a warning. That's when he noticed it. The barn door wasn't just creaking in the wind. It was banging shut and open in a rhythmic pattern, like someone or something was trapped inside. Heart racing, he grabbed the door and pushed it open. Inside, the barn was dim, heavy with dust and the faint stench of rot. In the far corner of the loft above, he froze. There sat a young woman, hunched over, her shoulders trembling, her face hidden behind long strands of dark hair, as she cried softly. Mark's voice would have trembled if he had spoken, but his words caught in his throat. He could only watch as the woman continued weeping, relentless and broken. He took a careful step forward, but before he could reach her, the wooden floor beneath him gave way. The boards splintered, and with a sharp crack, he plummeted down into the darkness below. Groaning in pain, he pushed himself up, blinking as his eyes adjusted. Then he froze. Around him, half buried in the dirt, were scattered human bones, a skull, ribs, a woman's shoe, and near his feet, a delicate bracelet, the kind a young woman might wear. Panic surged through him. His breathing turned ragged as he clawed his way out of the pit, scrambling back toward the broken floor. Finally, he pulled himself free and staggered outside, gasping for air. But when he looked back toward the barn's loft, the woman in the corner was gone. Mark, trembling and covered in dust, hurried back to the house in a state of panic. His chest tightened, the uneasiness clawing deeper into him with every step. Something about the bracelet lingered in his memory. When he finally reached the living room, he realized his hands were gripping it tightly. He hadn't even noticed he had carried it out of the barn. The tarnished metal and cracked beads glimmered faintly in the dim light, and it made his skin crawl. Sinking into a chair, Mark spread the photographs he had found earlier in the attic across the table. He shuffled through them frantically, his eyes darting between faces, searching for answers. Then he froze. There it was, the same bracelet, only newer, intact, shining, resting on the wrist of a young girl, smiling at the camera. Sophie. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His hands shook as he sifted through more photos, the unease rising to dread. Father, mother, daughter. Again and again, the same faces stared back. Alan, his wife, Helena, and their daughter Sophie. But then, Mark stopped. One photo stood out. Alan was there, Sophie too. But the woman beside them wasn't Helena. Her features were different, sharper, colder, her presence unsettling even through the faded image. On the back of the photo, faint handwriting revealed a name. Catherine, the stepmother. While all these things were happening, Mark faintly smelled gas seeping from the kitchen. But his mind was so consumed by the bracelet, the photos, and the unease settling over him that he couldn't process it. The thought barely brushed his senses before vanishing under the weight of his dread. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, fast, stuttering, unnerving. The whole house pulsed with the erratic glow, until, without warning, everything went black. Silence followed for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. And then the TV crackled to life on its own. The screen flickered, loading, before settling on a local news channel. Mark's chest tightened as his eyes widened. The house on the broadcast looked eerily familiar. The same creaking roofline, the same front porch steps. It was Alan's house. On the news, muffled screams tore through the background. A woman's voice shrieking, "She's here! She will kill me!" Over and over. The cries grew frantic, desperate, until police lights cut across the camera frame. Officers tried to calm the situation, but before anyone could react, a woman burst from the front door. Her clothes clung to her body, soaked from head to toe, as if she had been submerged in water. Her hair hung limp, dripping. She screamed, wild and unhinged. Then, without warning, her face shifted into a blank, expressionless mask. Before the officers could reach her, she struck a match, a single tiny flame. And then, she was ablaze. The fire consumed her in seconds as the police and onlookers recoiled in horror. She ran aimlessly, flailing, her body engulfed, until she collapsed. It was too late. Mark stared, frozen in horror. His hand trembled as he realized he knew that woman. His eyes darted to the photograph he still held in his right hand, the one of Alan with Catherine. And at that very moment, the photo ignited in his hand. The edges curled, blackening, the paper crumbling to ash. Mark dropped it instantly, his breath caught in his throat. He staggered back, realization chilling him to the core. The woman on TV and the Catherine in the photo were the same. Mark was in full panic now. His chest tightened, his breathing shallow and uneven, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip anything. His mind screamed, "Leave, leave, leave." He rushed into the room where his things were, shoving clothes and belongings into his backpack, aimlessly, messily, his movements frantic. Zippers snagged, straps tangled, but he didn't care. Survival was the only thought that pulsed through his head. Bag slung over his shoulder, he bolted into the hall toward the front door, only to trip violently, his foot catching on the rug. His body hit the floor hard, his head slamming against the wood with a sickening thud. For a few seconds, everything blurred. His vision bulged in and out, and when he finally blinked himself back into awareness, the world had changed. The house around him was the same, yet not. The rotten walls were now clean, polished, and new. The broken furniture was whole again, neatly arranged. Curtains fluttered lightly in the evening breeze. Fresh flowers sat in vases, and the air carried no dust, no decay. It was as if he had been thrown back in time. And then he saw her, a woman in the kitchen across the hall. His stomach dropped. He knew her face, the young woman from the photographs, and the same figure he had seen on the TV, burning alive. Catherine. Deliberate steps, lifting a heavy gallon container. Without a word, she walked toward one of the bedrooms. Mark, trembling, followed at a distance, his every breath shaky. Inside the room, a young girl lay asleep on the bed. Sophie, the daughter from the photos. Catherine stood over her for a moment, silent, cold. Then, without hesitation, she tilted the container. Liquid splashed over Sophie's body, drenching her and the sheets in kerosene. Sophie woke with a gasp, confusion flashing across her face, quickly replaced by sheer terror. Her screams tore through the house, pleading desperately for her life. But Catherine did not hear. Mark screamed too, begging her to stop, but his voice fell into emptiness. He wasn't there. Catherine struck a match. The tiny flame flickered and then roared into a nightmare. She tossed it onto Sophie. The girl ignited instantly, her body a living torch. Her shrieks filled the house, raw and inhuman. She stumbled from the bed, running, clawing at herself, crashing into furniture as flames engulfed everything she touched. Mark screamed in helpless horror as Sophie bolted from the room, blazing, and burst through the front door, her burning figure staggering toward the barn. Catherine followed in calm, measured steps. The fire spread quickly. The illusion shattered. In a blink, Mark was back in his time. The house once again rotten, aged, decrepit. But the bed in front of him still burned, its flames fresh and violent. And then, Sophie appeared, standing beside the bed, her body pale, spectral. She turned slowly, her head twisting unnaturally until her gaze locked with Mark's. Her hollow eyes bored into him, her face frozen between agony and accusation. Mark's scream caught in his throat as his legs gave out beneath him. He scrambled, desperate, toward the door. He reached the knob, twisting, pulling with all his strength, only for it to rip clean off in his hands. The gas smell hit him then. Thick, suffocating, overwhelming. His chest heaved, his eyes widened, and then the explosion ripped through the house. The force hurled Mark backward, shattering glass, blasting him through the doorway. He hit the ground outside with bone-cracking force as shards rained around him, fire consuming the house behind. Mark lay sprawled on the wet grass, gasping, his body broken and bleeding from cuts and burns. Every nerve screamed in pain. But what struck him harder was the silence. The fire roared behind him, devouring the old house, sending sparks clawing into the night sky. Yet around him, the world felt eerily still. No neighbors, no sirens, no footsteps, just the crackling of the flames and the distant call of a crow. He tried to move. His hand trembled as he pushed himself onto his elbows, glass digging into his skin. Through the smoke, he swore he saw figures, dark, faint silhouettes, watching him from the tree line. Dozens of them, too still to be human. He blinked, and they were gone. Mark's chest tightened as a cough tore through him. He turned his head toward the burning house and froze. In the window of the upstairs bedroom, framed by fire, stood Sophie. Not burning, not screaming, just staring at him, her pale face glowing in the firelight. Her hand rested against the glass, the same bracelet glinting on her wrist. But Sophie only stared, her expression unreadable. And then she vanished into the smoke. Mark's body gave out. He collapsed, his vision blurring as flames and night bled together. He expected blackness, silence, an end. Instead, when his eyes flickered open again, he was no longer outside. He was lying in the attic, the same attic, the trunk beside him, closed and locked, the air heavy with dust, as though nothing had happened. But on his hand, burnt into his skin, was the outline of a bracelet, and from the shadows of the attic came the sound of footsteps, soft, slow, approaching.